Okay, so in our discussion of ecosystems and kind of their importance, their ecosystem functions and their ecosystem services, an interesting one to look at is what we call a riparian zone. And a riparian zone is not a particularly large ecosystem in terms of area. It's actually relatively small, but it has a very important set of functions and services that the human species definitely depends on. So if you look at this image here, this is of a kind of a typical canyon, if you will, in the Santa Barbara region. And the riparian zone is just this zone of vegetation that's right along the edges of a stream. And so if you were to kind of go down into this area and you were to hike it, there's a stream that's running right through here. And the species that are often, common in this zone, you would be finding things like western sycamore is a common tree species. That's really this kind of light colored one that are all over in here. These light colored trees are pretty much all western sycamore. There's others in there. There's alder, there's willow. These are species that are quite common in the Santa Barbara riparian zones. Just on the outside of that, if you were to go just a little bit more upslope, you'd start to see quite a bit more of kind of these darker trees in here. And most of these guys are the coast live oak. So coast live oak is not generally considered a riparian species. It's one that's more adapted to being kind of more upslope away from the water. They're a bit more drought tolerant. They can handle a lower amount of water availability. As a result, they grow slower. And one of the things that you're seeing in here is basically the western sycamore, the alder, and the willow are highly dependent on water. They are not very drought tolerant, so they have to live right next to the creeks where their root system can get into the groundwater, for example. But that also allows them to grow very quickly, and they tend to outcompete other tree species that grow more slowly, like the coast live oak. So they competitively exclude the coast live oak from these riparian zones. Now, what are some of these, critical issues? And one of the key issues that we depend on for humans is the water quality. But of course, this isn't just beneficial to humans. This is also habitat for many different species. And so we're going to just take a quick look at some of the ways in which the riparian zone helps preserve not only, an existing riparian zone itself on land is critical habitat, but it also really helps preserve the quality of the aquatic habitat that's running through it. So here's a kind of a cross section, if you will. I just basically took a picture with a camera half in and half out of water of a typical sort of riparian zone. And you can see, this is all pretty dense vegetation all along the edges here. If you were to look up, there's actually quite a bit of shade generated because there's a large amount of canopy that's carrying over the top there that's kind of shading this creek. And so what are some of the ecosystem functions of this riparian zone that benefit the aquatic system? Well, one of the key ones is this runoff. It decreases the amount of runoff that would otherwise be going into this riparian zone without any real obstacles. So as water's kind of running off from the sides here, it doesn't just flow straight into the creek. It's running into all this vegetation. It's sinking into the soil because of all the kind of natural mulch that's there with the leaf litter and the twigs, healthy soils. And so it infiltrates, it percolates down into the soil, and then may actually infiltrate out from the soil through the groundwater into the creek in a much slower manner than if it was just to rush directly into the creek. So what this does is it allows that water to come in contact with all the different soil particles, all the microbes, the different fungi, and all the different organisms and physical structure that actually create this kind of what we call biofilter that helps decrease the sediment that otherwise would rush in, as well as it would decrease any nutrients And we'll talk about why too much in the way of nutrients is a problem a little bit later, as well as other types of pollutants. All of those are basically decreased because of that riparian zone kind of blocking and letting that water sink into the soil, and all of these organisms breaking stuff down, as well as, especially when it comes to things like the nutrients, you have all the plant roots that are pulling up those nutrients into the plants, and therefore those nutrients aren't just flowing freely into the creek or river. The shade, that's another important one, and that's because this means the water down here is cooler. If it's cooler, it actually can hold a higher amount of what we call dissolved oxygen, and it's often abbreviated DO. Cooler water can just hold more dissolved oxygen than warmer water. It's just a basic principle of liquids and gases. The cooler the liquid, the more gas it can hold. And so with shade, you're actually allowing it to stay cooler during the day, decreasing the loss of oxygen to the atmosphere, and so it really increases the amount of dissolved oxygen. You can see in this creek, just from what we've already talked about, how clear it is, right? So there's a very low amount of the sediment in here, so it's not getting a lot of erosion and runoff into this creek, showing that the health of this surrounding riparian zone. If you were to take a measure of dissolved oxygen in this creek, it would be very high. So a high level of dissolved oxygen means a lot more species can survive in the creek. The lower the level of dissolved oxygen, the fewer species that can survive. In addition to that, I'll switch to a different color. It might be a little bit easier to see. In addition to that, you have just like the physical structure. So you can see in here, the rocks that are in here that are kind of embedded in the bank. You can see in the background there's logs and things that have fallen in from the surrounding vegetation. So branches and such. That creates a lot of different types of habitat. So there's a high level of habitat diversity in these creeks. Pools, riffles, rapids, all of those little spaces in a creek. If you were to follow this creek down and look at each one of those, you would actually find a different community of invertebrates that are found in each of those. Some are very specialized to being in still water. Others have adaptations to cling to surfaces and feed off the water moving past them. And so each one of those little microhabitats ends up being another place for a community to exist and to grow. All those invertebrate communities then turn out to be, of course, food for the next trophic level above them. So for things like small fish that can then feed larger fish, which could then feed a number of other species, including species coming in from the land areas, such as birds, bears, humans, etc. You see here this measure of things like turbidity and algae. That turbidity, that's that issue of decreased sediment. So if this was a very turbid creek, you would not be able to see very well. Like if I were to take a picture under the water, you would not be able to see much of anything. But again, you see it's nice, clear water. That means there's not much floating around in there that is blocking our ability to see through it. And too high a turbidity is a problem because there's a lot of species that are visual and they would not be able to see very well. Turbidity caused by that sediment. Think of this as like, little particulates. It's sand, soil, clay particles. If you're breathing through gills, then that is actually going to damage your gills. It's going to irritate your gills as you're trying to move water through them, to pick up that dissolved oxygen. So it's going to hinder your ability to breathe. That turbidity, that sediment could also basically settle down on the creek bed and bury nests of eggs, for example, for things like steelhead trout or for salmon, and can suffocate them because it wouldn't allow that oxygen to move through and oxygenate the eggs. And then the kind of the last thing it could potentially do that I want to talk about is it creates a place where sunlight can be absorbed, the heat from the sun can be absorbed. It can actually warm up the creek. So a highly turbid creek might actually be warmer than one that's clear. So the nice clear water is a good indication that you're not getting that runoff and you're not getting all that sediment built up and you're not getting the negative effects of that turbidity. The algae we'll talk about specifically in another lecture, but too much algae can actually be a problem, and that too much algae is triggered by that nutrient flow. So if you get too many nutrients flowing into the system too quickly, you can get a big algal growth, and that large algal population can result in something that we call cultural eutrophication. And so we'll talk about that separately in a separate lecture. But the end result of that cultural eutrophication is if you have too much algae, if your algae go up too high, you can actually get a decline in dissolved oxygen. And it seems a little counterintuitive at first because plants produce oxygen, but I'll explain why that actually results in overall loss of dissolved oxygen. Another thing that we find in riparian zones that's important to understand for the communities of species that live there, the biodiversity, if you will, is that the aquatic species really do depend on the terrestrial habitat, and the terrestrial species really depend on the aquatic habitat. And this is a data set from a study, and basically what it's showing is this amount of what we call allocotonous prey. And so what allocotonous means is, in this regard, is prey from the other system. So when you're looking at this one here, like birds, what it's saying is on this proportion of allocotonous prey eaten, what this means is up here, that's 80% of the food that these birds are eating, and these are months down here, so that's May, right? May, June, July, August, September, October, etc. In May, there are some bird species, these are just different bird species in here, abbreviated. In May, some bird species are eating as much as 80% of their food coming from the creek in this riparian zone. So generally what you're seeing here is, for example, a lot of insects have their larval forms in the creek, and they're actually aquatic. And then as they mature into their adult forms, they leave the creek and fly into the air and become food for the birds that are actually living in that riparian zone. In addition to that, if you look at the fish group, right, so different fish species, different times during the year, and again, you can see multiple species up here that are in this kind of 80% to almost 100% of their food is coming from the land. So this again is many of these are insects that are laying their eggs in the creek or falling into the creek, and the fish are consuming them as a food supply. One of the other things that's not always represented here, though, is in a lot of these riparian zones, and I'll just kind of briefly go back to this previous slide, is notice there's a little bit of plant material. You can see kind of the plant material down in here, but there's not a lot of vegetation in these creeks. Where is the base of the food chain for a lot of these creek food chains? And it's coming from here. See all these leaves and all the leaves from the trees up here? Well, all those leaves are falling down into the creek, and those actually serve as the base of the food chain for a lot of invertebrates, invertebrate herbivores that then feed on those leaves, and those invertebrate herbivores then serve as food for invertebrate carnivores that then, of course, can be food for things like fish and other species in the creek. So you have both the vegetation coming in, the fallen leaf matter, the twigs and things that are falling into the creek, being fed on by herbivores. You also have this really direct relationship where the birds are literally feeding off of insects and other things coming out of the creek, and fish feeding on things falling into the creek. And the point of this is there's just a major flow of energy between the two systems. And so you damage one of those systems and you're going to damage the other because you're cutting off a major source of energy for a significant component of the species community that lives in that zone.